Hey friend, you know there are moments in life when you've prayed, waited, and done all you know to do, and it finally looks like your breakthrough is within reach, but then, suddenly, obstacles show up from nowhere? It's like every door that was once open begins to close, and you start asking yourself, did I miss God's timing? Did I make a mistake? That's exactly what George Müller went through during one of the most defining moments of his ministry. He had already seen God perform countless miracles, food provided for, hundreds of orphans when there was none, donations arriving just in time, prayers answered in astonishing ways. But this time, God was about to teach him something even deeper: the beauty of patience under pressure. At this point, Müller had already gathered over £27,000, a massive amount in those days. It was more than enough to buy land and even begin building the next orphan houses. But George Müller wasn't a man who rushed ahead simply because the numbers looked good. He believed in something far more secure than money: God's timing. You see, Müller's secret wasn't just that he prayed. It was how he prayed, patiently, persistently, and expectantly. He believed that faith doesn't mean acting fast, it means acting when God says move. The Bible says in Habakkuk 2 verse 3, "For the vision is yet for an appointed time. Though it tarries, wait for it. Because it will surely come, it will not tarry." That verse could have been written for George Müller. For years, he had his eyes on a particular piece of land. About 18 acres of beautiful open ground, just across from his existing orphan houses. It was perfect in every way. Each time he walked by, he felt a stirring in his spirit. Hundreds of times, he prayed for that land, believing it would one day become home to even more children in need. But Müller didn't move prematurely. Even when he had the funds, he waited. He didn't want to own the land unless God was the one giving it. He once said that he preferred to wait patiently, submissively, for God's own time. That patience wasn't laziness, it was faith in motion. And then, one day, after much waiting, that peace, that quiet, unmistakable whisper from heaven, came. Müller knew it was time. You know that feeling, right? When you've prayed for something for so long and suddenly your heart feels settled, not anxious, not desperate, just sure. That's what happened to him. He felt confident that God was now saying, "Go forward." So, full of faith, he went to the land agent and asked if the property was available. The agent confirmed it was indeed for sale. And for a moment, it must have felt like the long wait was over. But almost immediately, challenges appeared, not one, but three. First, the land was leased out for more than 2 years. Müller needed it within 6 months, but it wouldn't be available until March 1867. That was a huge setback. Then, the second problem came. The owner's asking price was £7,000, far above its real value. And before he could even catch his breath, a third difficulty appeared. The Bristol Waterworks Company planned to use the same land to build a reservoir and were about to get parliamentary approval for it. 3 major roadblocks, all at once. Now, imagine that moment. You've waited years, prayed faithfully, and finally stepped out in obedience. And suddenly it feels like heaven has gone silent. Many of us would start to question whether we heard God right. Maybe we'd even try to fix things ourselves or compromise just to make it work. But Müller didn't do any of that. Instead, he paused and prayed again. He reminded himself of Psalm 9 verses 9 to 10. "The Lord also will be a refuge for the oppressed, a refuge in times of trouble. And they that know thy name will put their trust in thee. For thou, Lord, hast not forsaken them that seek thee." Müller held on to that promise like an anchor. He had seen enough of God's faithfulness to know that difficulties don't mean denial. They mean delay for greater glory. So he decided to bring every obstacle back to the one who could move mountains. He prayed daily, several times a day, specifically about those 3 problems. He didn't panic. He didn't plead with people. He talked to God. You know, friend, sometimes we spend more time talking to others about our problems than talking to God about them. But Müller knew the secret. The shortest route to a solution is through prayer, not panic. And little by little, things began to shift. The first issue was with the Bristol Waterworks Company. Müller reached out to the directors, explained his intentions, and asked if their project would affect the land he hoped to buy. To his surprise, they responded kindly. They assured him that they would only need a small portion of the land, not enough to interfere with his plans. In fact, they even said that if it could be avoided, they wouldn't take any part of it at all. That was the first breakthrough. Then came the second challenge, the tenant. Müller prayed again, asking God to help him approach the man in the right spirit. He didn't want tension or arguments. He wanted peace. So when he met the tenant, he explained everything openly and expressed his desire to handle the matter fairly. The tenant listened and asked for a few days to think about it. Müller didn't pressure him. He waited. After about a week, the tenant came back with an answer that could only have been God's doing. He said, "Since the land is to be used for such a purpose, I will not stand in the way. I only ask to be compensated fairly for the improvements I've made." Can you imagine Müller's relief? What could have become a legal or emotional battle turned into a peaceful agreement, just because he chose patience over panic. Then, the third and biggest obstacle, the price. £7,000 was still too much. Müller knew the land wasn't worth that much, so he prayed daily that God would touch the owner's heart. And that's exactly what happened. After some back and forth, the owner finally agreed to sell for £5,500, which was £1,500 less than the original price. That's not just a small discount. That's the kind of favor that only God can arrange. It reminds me of Proverbs 21 verse 1, which says, "The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. He directs it like a watercourse wherever he pleases." Friend, have you ever experienced something like that, when it seemed impossible, but somehow everything worked out perfectly, almost effortlessly? That's how you know it wasn't coincidence. It was God. When all was settled, Müller looked back and realized that every delay, every difficulty, had been part of God's design. If the land had been available earlier, if the tenant hadn't been there, or if the price had been immediately low, Müller might not have prayed as deeply. He might not have seen God's hand as clearly. But now, every step testified to divine guidance. It's so beautiful because this story doesn't just teach us about one man's faith. It shows us how God works in ours too. Sometimes He lets challenges come, not to break us, but to build us. He lets the waiting stretch us so that when the blessing comes, we know it wasn't luck, it was answered prayer. By this point, George Müller had crossed what many of us would call the hardest part, the waiting, the uncertainty, the praying without visible progress. But even after everything began to fall into place, the water company no longer an issue, the tenant agreeing to leave peacefully, and the price dropping, he didn't rush to celebrate yet. He stayed in that posture of quiet humility, still seeking God's confirmation. You see, Müller understood something most people miss. Just because something becomes possible doesn't mean it's God's will yet. He had learned to distinguish between good timing and God's timing. There's a verse in Psalm 37 verse 7 that captures this perfectly. "Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for Him. Do not fret when people succeed in their ways, when they carry out their wicked schemes." It's like God saying, "Don't move because others are moving. Wait until I say it's time." So Müller went back into prayer again, not because he doubted, but because he wanted to be sure he was walking step by step with God. I love that. He could have easily said, "Well, everything worked out, it must be fine," but instead, he knelt again in surrender, asking, "Lord, do I move now?" And friend, that's such a gentle lesson for us. Sometimes what looks like progress can be premature. The doors may open, the people may agree, and everything may look right. But real peace only comes when your heart is aligned with heaven's timing. And Müller got that peace. It was quiet, deep, and steady, the kind that Philippians 4 verse 7 describes. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. With that assurance, he finalized the purchase of the land. It was 18 acres, wide, green, beautiful, and positioned perfectly across the road from his other orphan houses. When the papers were signed and the land officially became theirs, Müller didn't boast. He didn't pat himself on the back for his persistence or clever negotiation skills. He bowed his head and whispered, "The Lord has done this." And truly, it was the Lord. Every part of that story was an answered prayer, not a single piece happened by accident. Even the obstacles were part of the miracle because they became the very tools God used to shape the outcome. Now here's where it gets really powerful, the reflection behind the miracle. Müller wrote that when he looked back, he realized how many times God had allowed apparent death blows to come right after moments of great hope. It's like just when everything starts to look promising, something happens that makes it seem like the dream is dead. But in reality, that's when faith begins to grow roots. He said he found this pattern hundreds of times since he began walking with God. That when everything looks hardest, it's often because a new breakthrough is around the corner. Isn't that so true? Sometimes your faith gets tested most fiercely right before your blessing manifests. It reminds me of James 1 verses 3-4, which says, "The testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." Friend, maybe that's where you are right now, in that uncomfortable waiting place, where you've done all you can, but the answer seems delayed. Maybe you're praying for a home, a job, healing, or direction, and it feels like God has forgotten. But what if, like George Müller, God is simply refining your patience so that when your land finally comes, you'll know it was His doing and not yours? Let's bring this closer to today's world. Think about how we handle things now. We live in a culture that rewards speed. Everything is instant messaging, instant noodles, instant delivery, instant results. So when God tells us to wait, it feels almost unbearable. But sometimes the waiting room is God's training ground. Take, for example, people building something new, maybe a business, a ministry, or a project. Often, when funds come in or an opportunity opens, the temptation is to jump immediately. But timing still matters. What looks like the right door might not be the right moment. Müller teaches us that even when the yes seems obvious, it's still wise to ask, "Lord, is this your yes or just my excitement?" And here's something that stood out to me in Müller's story. After everything was finalized, he made sure the land was conveyed to trustees, the same ones responsible for the previous orphan houses. That's accountability. It shows that Müller didn't just trust God spiritually. He also handled everything practically and responsibly. His faith wasn't blind. It was grounded, balanced, and mature. That's such a good reminder, isn't it? Faith doesn't mean being careless. It means trusting God completely while still doing your part wisely. Müller didn't just pray. He prayed and acted in integrity. That's what true stewardship looks like. And as the dust settled, Müller saw more than a transaction. He saw God's fingerprint over every detail. The reduced price, the willing tenant, the nearby location, the accessible gas line, the completed sewer system, everything fit together perfectly. It was as if God had been quietly preparing this land all along, waiting for the right moment to hand it over. Friend, I don't know what land you've been praying for. Maybe it's not physical soil, but a dream, a promise, or a purpose you've been waiting to see fulfilled. But if there's one thing George Müller's life proves, it's that faith and patience are never wasted. God's timing may test you, but His plan will always bless you. So maybe, just like Müller, you're looking at something that seems delayed, something that keeps getting harder even as you pray. But here's the truth: difficulty doesn't mean denial. It's often the stage where God's glory is being written behind the scenes. Hold on to Isaiah 64 verse 4, where it says, "Since ancient times no one has heard, no ear has perceived, no eye has seen any God besides you, who acts on behalf of those who wait for Him." Müller waited, he trusted, and when the moment came, he acted, and because of that, thousands of children who had no home found one. That's what faith can do when it's anchored in patience and obedience. You know, the beautiful thing about faith stories, like George Müller's, is that they don't just tell us what happened. They remind us what's still possible. When the land was finally his, Müller didn't stop to rest or boast. Instead, his first instinct was gratitude. He gathered his collaborators and said something that gives me chills every time I think about it. "Let us thank God for what He has done, for He alone has wrought this." Imagine that moment. No social media announcement, no crowd, No public speech, just quiet thanksgiving. That's the heart of someone who truly understands. That faith is not about getting things. It's about knowing the one who gives them. And honestly, that's where many of us struggle today. We often remember to pray before the blessing, but forget to worship after it arrives. We fight in faith for the miracle, but when it comes, we are already looking for the next one. Müller teaches us to pause, to acknowledge that what we have is the fingerprint of grace. You see, Müller's gratitude wasn't shallow, it was rooted in humility. He knew that every answered prayer was a chance to testify of God's faithfulness. It's why he kept meticulous records of each provision, every prayer, every miracle. He wanted future generations to see the evidence of a God who still listens. And maybe that's what you and I should take from this, that every answered prayer deserves a memory. Whether it's written in a journal, shared as a testimony, or just whispered in a quiet prayer of thanks, remembrance is what keeps faith alive. In Psalm 103 verse 2, David says, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits." That's not just poetic, it's powerful advice. Forgetfulness kills gratitude, and gratitude strengthens faith. As Müller moved forward with building the new orphanhouses, he never forgot where it all started, on his knees, in prayer, waiting for divine instruction. Every decision about the construction was brought before God again. Even the smallest details, the materials, the layout, the finances, were guided by prayer. And the results? Unbelievable. Each house stood as a monument of faith, not just buildings of brick and stone, but living testimonies of trust and divine provision. Thousands of orphans were fed, clothed, educated, and loved, not because Müller was wealthy or influential, but because he dared to believe that God was enough. Hey friend, pause and think about that for a second. What could your life look like if you truly believed that God was enough? We live in a world where security is often tied to savings, followers, and status. But Müller had none of that, and yet he had peace, joy, and purpose. Not because life was easy, but because he knew who held his life together. That makes me think of 2 Corinthians 9 verse 8, which says, "And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work." That's not just a verse, it's a promise. Müller's life was living proof of it. He didn't only pray when he lacked. He prayed as a lifestyle. Prayer was his oxygen. His relationship with God wasn't built on panic but on partnership. And maybe that's what we are called to rediscover. A kind of faith that doesn't just use God as a rescue rope, but walks with him daily, trusting him in both abundance and need. There's a story Müller once shared about how the orphanages never ran out of food. Not because there was always plenty, but because provision always arrived right on time. Sometimes they had no food in the kitchen, and while they prayed, a knock would come on the door, someone bringing bread, milk, or donations. No one outside knew of the need. Only God did. Friend, that's what walking by faith looks like, not seeing the provision yet, but setting the table anyway. It's trusting that while you don't know how, you know who. And if I'm being honest, that kind of trust doesn't come overnight. It grows through seasons of waiting, through little tests that teach your heart to lean on God's consistency. Think about your own life. Maybe there's something you've been believing for, something that's taken longer than expected. Maybe you've prayed and prayed, but the results are slow. I just want to tell you today, don't quit now. If Müller's story tells us anything, it's that delay is not denial. In Habakkuk 2 verse 3, it says, "For the vision is yet for an appointed time. Though it tarries, wait for it. Because it will surely come, it will not tarry." That's the heartbeat of Müller's faith, persistence. He didn't let time discourage him. He let time prove God's faithfulness. And you know what else is powerful? The way Müller's testimony still changes lives today, centuries later. His orphanhouses might have been built with bricks, but his faith built something even greater, a legacy. Generations are still inspired by his unshakable trust in God. So maybe that's what God wants to do through your own waiting. 2. To build something eternal through your faith. Maybe your story, like Müller's, will become someone else's reason to believe again. Because miracles don't end when the story closes. They echo. They ripple through generations. They whisper to hearts that feel forgotten. God still answers prayer. And you know what I love most about Müller? He never saw himself as special. He often said, "I am as weak as any man can be, but my strength is in God." That's the secret right there, not perfection, but dependence. In a modern world where everyone wants to look capable, Müller's humility stands out. He reminds us that it's okay to admit you can't, because that's where God begins. And maybe, friend, that's exactly what you needed to hear today. That your weakness is not a disqualification, but an invitation. Because as 2 Corinthians 12 verse 9 says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." So, when you feel like you've done all you can and nothing's moving, remember Müller, not as a man who never struggled, but as one who chose to keep pressing even when everything said no. Because faith isn't just believing for miracles, it's believing through the waiting. And that's how God still writes his greatest stories, one prayer at a time.